better. Show me what you need to say. Maybe we should write a letter. Said, dear Mr. Man, we don't understand why poor people keep struggling, but you don't lend a helping hand. Matthew 5:5 say, the meek shall inherit the earth. We wanna be down that way, but you've been tripping since the day of your birth. Who says that to kill is a sin? It started at Brasenko War that your people bleed. Who says that water is a precious commodity? Then dropped a big old black oil set in the deep blue sea. Who told me, Mr. Man, that working around the clock, buying me a big house in the hood, cigarette ads on every block? Who told me, Mr. Man, that I got a right to moan? How about this big old hole in the ozone? What's wrong?
What's wrong
with the world today?
With the world today?
Things just got to get better. Dear Mr. Man, we don't understand. Maybe we should write a letter. Mercy, right. Gotta talk to that hungry something. Let me ride. Swing down, sweet Terry 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 something.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised.
Hope of the world is in our generation. It's all left up to us to change this present situation. Take a lesson from our elders. Don't make the same mistake. Let's fill the world with love. Get rid of all the hate. Our elders taught us one thing, but practice another. Just look what happened to the Indian and the brother. Take it up. 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 WELOVE
108
FM.
Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
Welcome, all of you who have rejoined us in this, our 4th gathering. Today, we will conclude with a gathering that focuses on the here and now, focuses on where we need to go from here. In a moment, we will welcome our panelists, Ricky Defoe and Ricardo Leve Morales, and Joe Fagan. We want to, first of all, start out with the recognition of the place that we're in. I introduced that place for myself in the past Montevideo is the name of this town now, but this area, this immediate area that I'm in, is otherwise known as the place where the two rivers converge, and that is the Minnesota and the Chippewa rivers. I am just a few miles, about 10 minutes away from Lac qui Parle, and another 10 minutes from the Upper Sioux Reservation in Granite Falls. So that's my particular location. Ricky Defoe, I'd like very much if you would introduce yourself and then help us in locating where we are as Minnesotans in regard to our being on native land.
Okay. Thank you, Kogiman. Can I be heard? Am I heard?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Bonjour, Guinois. Guivizan Soma. Bishun and do dam, Nagacho Nong and do Chiba. Niwi Tajandam, Bungi Gego, Oawasa, Ingi Kendan, Bungi Ingi Kendan, Akin, Mewenje Go, Dakota Oyate, Minoa Dash, Niboa, Bimat Zigoma, Ginwensi Go Yajikoma, Geget Nungum, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Minoa, Dakota Oyate, Migo Ingu Buana Go Ma Yajik Nungum, Wewini Bimat Ziyang. Migot Sago, Bizendaya Gongo, Manito, Ginoa, Niji Bimatazi. So greetings to everybody here in a good Sunday afternoon. And I want to start by saying that I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that yous are all here. And plus to say this, that in our society, there's traditionalists, and then you have your city folks, and then you have your assimilated folks, and then you have your descendants. So there's 4 at least divisions within our society. So one person cannot really, has a lot of problems to say they speak for everybody. So I say that I just know a little bit, and I'll be speaking for myself here. In the past, we've seen how natural law is immigration, and to seek a better life, to go and flee from violence. In Ojibwe Nation, we had those prophecies to flee, to go where the water grows, where the food grows on water, and it happens to be Minnesota. But we have to acknowledge that the Dakota Nation and other nations were here before our arrival. So in our ceremonies, we acknowledge all of those peoples that were here before our arrival here. So in this way, we have, they say life is a ceremony. So we acknowledge all of those nations that were here. They have a line of demarcation designated by a treaty of the past. I can't put my finger on which exact date it was, but it divided the Dakota Nation and Ojibwe Nation diagonally across Minnesota. And in Minnesota particularly, we have the Dakota Nations of the Upper Sioux, Granite Falls, and the Lower Sioux, Morton, and also the Prairie Island Dakota Nation near Red Wing. And also in Minnesota, we have the White Earth Nation. You've got the Leech Lake Nation. You've got the Bois Forte Nation. You've got Grand Portage in the north. And then you have Fond du Lac. And then you have Mille Lacs, make up the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. But you also have the Red Lake Nation. So all of those nations are within Minnesota. Minnesota is a Dakota word. So we acknowledge all of those ones here in indigenous lands. So we say, Anamikageg, welcome to you all. Miigwech Bizendai. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ricky. I'm informed that one of our panelists may not be joining us today, so alerting Joe and Ricardo and Ricky that you may be working with more time than anticipated earlier. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ricky, with locating us in that history. And we stand in appreciation for the peoples who have watched over this land, this beautiful land that we are a part of, the lakes and the prairies and all that there is. We're grateful for the inheritance that they have given to us. I'd like now to invite Jenna into the conversations, after which I will introduce myself just a bit, but especially make reference to our sponsoring organizations. Jenna, I'm asking you to say a few words about expectations for today, how we will be organized as we move forward in today's panel and the following chat room discussion.
Okay, well, I'll just start by saying that we're anti-racism study dialogue circles, and we've been presenting these conversations now for the last 5 weeks. I just wanted to say a couple of words about some of the programming we have coming up in the fall. We do 10-week-long anti-racism study dialogue circles that are an opportunity to do kind of an intensive study of the history and legacy of racism in this country. And I highly encourage anybody who's interested by these conversations to check that out on our website, which is asdicircle.org. You can subscribe to our newsletter there and receive updates over the course of the summer as we get more information out about that program. People say it's transformative, so I highly recommend you read about it and consider joining us this fall for one of those circles. And the last thing I'll say is just a kind of overview of the breakout sessions that will occur at the end of this meeting. Some people have had some difficulty joining those in past weeks, so I just wanted to be as clear as I can about how you should do that. Go to our website, asdicircle.org, asdicircle.org, and right on the homepage, you'll see the link to the breakout session at the very top of the page. It should also be in your email, and the email you received an hour before this program started. Just click that link, and that session will start at about 3:40 p.m. today. So there will be a little bit of time between the end of this session and that one. So just wait until that one starts. And at the end of the session, I'll post that link again in the chat, just so everybody has access to that. And then if anybody is in the audience who has facilitated a workshop or a circle before and would like to facilitate a breakout room, just send me a little note in the chat that you would like to do that, and I'll make sure that you are facilitating one of those rooms. So thank you so much to anybody who's able to do that, and we can move on. I think that's all I have, Kogiman.
Thank you, Jenna. Our workshop series is sponsored by FREC and ASDIC. FREC, of course, means Facilitating Racial Equity Collaborative, and ASDIC is Anti-Racism Study Dialogue Circles, and we are very happy to conclude with this 4th session and looking forward to ways that we can continue our conversations. One way of continuing the conversation is through the FREC, the FREC Overcoming Racism Conference, which will be this November. I believe the date is the 13th and 14th. Friday and Saturday, November 13th and 14th. And this will be Zoom facilitated. So there is information up on the Overcoming Racism Conference website. And so please do check that out. The theme is there, the identification of the keynote speakers, everything that you'd wish to know. And this coming Monday is the last day for the proposals to be received. I know that there is always some wiggle room in terms of proposals that that come in after that date. But if you have in mind to give a workshop and you want to present your proposal, at least send some information regarding that intent and perhaps even a description of what you have in mind. And Barb, Rose, or Becky Montgomery, someone from that committee will be in contact with you to work out the process for your completing that. My name is Okogyaman, and again, I'm living in Montevideo, West Side person, living and working now in Montevideo. I've been with ASDIC since 2004 and with FREC since 2007, 2008, at the time of our founding. So with that, Maria, unless there's something that we should say in at least a cursory manner in regard to ways that we will participate in the circle, if you just highlight a few ideas, Maria, if you can do that. Ways that we will participate in the conversation that follows, and you're on mute. Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Sure, we follow a certain set of norms and guidelines for our circles, and we would like them to carry over into these discussions. A lot of it is involving the amount of airtime that we each choose to take or not take. We may be asked to kind of go against our traditional understandings of who speaks and who listens. So we just ask you to mind your own airtime, to speak from your own experience, to listen intently to others, and to engage in dialogue rather than argumentation. So yeah, basically just be mindful of your own participation in the group and share as you are able. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Welcome to the panelists. And Maria, would you kindly introduce Ricky and Ricardo? And Joe Fagan will be our moderator today for the discussion. I will step out at this point. And Joe, as I noted a moment ago, it appears that Chantel Allen will not be able to join us because from what I understand, she was at a demonstration or something like that and has not been able to get to a computer. So thank you, Joe, for stepping in a way perhaps that you did not intend. So Maria?
Yes. Well, you've already heard from Ricky DeVoe this afternoon, but Ricky is graciously filling in for Autumn Dilley, who is listed in the program, but could not be with us today. Ricky is a member and elder of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. He is the past co-chair of Duluth's Indigenous Commission and of the Oversight Committee for Reducing Racial Disparities in Juvenile Detention at the Arrowhead Juvenile Detention Center in Duluth. Ricky has served on the Diverse Task Force for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, which established a Citizens Review Board in Duluth. His current work is with the Interfaith Migrant Justice Group, also in Duluth, He is a current board member of Water Legacy, a nonprofit organization fighting for environmental justice with a particular focus on clean water. Ricky DeVoe is a passionate and tireless advocate for the traditional ways of life for Indigenous peoples. He is an advocate for the rights of nature, of wild rice, of language preservation and ceremony, and the drum. He speaks of the necessity of decolonizing one's own mind as a starting place for addressing the systems of injustice around us. Ricky is a longtime friend and facilitator with ASDIC, and his worldview has enriched the way in which we do our work. So welcome today, Ricky.
Thank you so much, Maria.
And then I would just like to introduce our other presenter, Ricardo Levins Morales, who describes himself as a healer and trickster organizer disguised as an artist. Born in Puerto Rico and raised with an awareness of the workings of colonial systems, Ricardo moved with his family to Chicago in 1967 and was drawn into the activism of those times. Ricardo's burgeoning activism took an artistic bent for which many of us in these times are profoundly grateful. His work has lifted up decades of social justice efforts and icons, from the Black Panthers and Young Lords onward, and still stands with farmers, environmental, labor, and racial justice and peace movements to this day. Ricardo sees his art and organizing practices as means to address individual, collective, and historical trauma. He co-leads workshops on trauma and resilience for organizers, as well as trainings on creative organizing, social justice strategy, and sustainable activism. In 2016, Ricardo and a handful of other local organizers decided to use the 150th anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department as an opportunity to deliver a community performance review of the police force. The small group of organizers has grown organically into MPD 150, a participatory, horizontally organized effort of local organizers, researchers, artists, and activists. Their performance review can be read in the report Enough is Enough, which is both the conclusion and the title of their review. We are honored to have you with us, Ricardo Levins Morales.
Thank you.
Ricky, we invite you.
Okay. Again, good afternoon to you all. I guess it's important to kind of give a little, to let you know who I am a little bit more. I graduated from a federal boarding school in South Dakota called Flandreau Indian School. That was in 1976. So I attended that boarding school from 73 to 76. And I didn't go to college right away. I just started to work and to get educated, so-called on the streets. So I really have no formal education beyond high school. Although I believe that the spirit moves people, and through relationships, we run into plenty of teachers. And this is what has happened in my life to become educated in this way. There's many that crossed in my life, Kogiman being one of those, and other ones, Tony Ledoux, and many, many others that teach and mentor those things. So they say, elders say that we learn something new every day, and when we gravitate towards those knowledgeable ones, that we, and two, become educated. So schooling didn't get in the way of my education, so to speak. I'd like to say that, but so I think about those things. So as time goes on, we still stay in relationship and hear others. They say, when I journeyed to Honduras, they said that the children are in the struggle. So when we're in the struggle, we learn, we become articulate, we know the language and things. So it's through that struggle, I think, that people become in community. And that's what's happening here. We see the movement now. I think when people begin a great work, they set the stage for the next generation, and those that are more energetic to pick up, and they watch what we do, and the knowledgeable ones do, and then take it from there. And I think that's what got us to this point here now that we find ourselves in, not only globally, but nationally here in the United States, with the current condition that we have. Many wonder why we feel the way we do. We look inside that it's the culture that's damaging to us, but I think that's what colonialism does. It makes us feel this way, inferior. And so we need to heal from that complex. So we reach out. Part of that oppression, we all know, is the systemic racism that is pervasive and pernicious in everything that we see, education, social, especially in the so-called justice system, which really is injustice. So I think that things play out that way. So in my relationship with others, I've come across, particularly in Duluth, and it was formerly the Duluth American Indian Commission, and we changed the name to Indigenous, just to get a different view and perspective of things, and we sound out that. And I met a lot of folks along the way that did not even want to change that way, a name, and what does that mean? So that changed the trajectory of thought collectively when you change the name. So those things have meaning. And then we start to dig into those struggles, those fights along the way. And we had a young man, David Crowd, that was killed by the police in Duluth. And I heard the chair of the Indigenous Commission at that, American Indian Commission at that time, say there was no anger in the community. So I looked up his phone number, and it just happened to be in the phone book. As I called him, I said, "There's a lot of anger in the community." And he says, "Maybe you should come down to the American Indian Commission and talk with us." So I did that. And that's how I got started in that, and in the fight for civilian oversight of law enforcement. I've traveled to Nicole in Cincinnati, and got some additional schooling on that. So I think that through that we see the concerted effort by the systems, not only the police, the prosecutors, and the judges, all play a role where they can point the finger at each other, and then there's some sort of really obfuscation, but you can't really say who's particularly, but it's a concerted effort. So it's quite daunting to know all those things and put them all into place. But I'm thinking my time is up there. I heard that there. I'm not so sure.
I'm trying to create a back channel so that I can talk to you while this is going on.
Hey, Ricky,
Yes.
you've still got plenty of time. So you're at 4
Okay.
minutes, or you're at about 5 minutes. So you can talk
Okay.
as long as you need to.
Yes. So this civilian oversight of law enforcement, we've learned a lot of things along the way. We know particularly that we cannot be rubbing elbows, so to speak. We have to be neutral when it comes to dealing with this institution of law enforcement. And most often those that are within inside will try to say that it's personal, they take things personal rather than systemic or structural. And it's hard to change the collective thought of people when they're deeply embedded and deeply invested in an institution with time and money and things. So it's been a struggle along the way, but we know that we learned some things along the way. We've invited the president of the local police union to join us on a couple of different occasions as we dialogued as a task force about civilian oversight of law enforcement, and they refused to come sit with us. And we worked together for 5 years in Duluth, off and on meeting. And so they said and then they put it out publicly that we never invited them. So that was a falsehood that they put out there. But when it came down to it, we met some folks from, particularly a woman, Eileen Luna, just happened to be a Cherokee woman from University of Arizona, Tucson, that helped us. And we did an audit of sorts on the police department and came up with some recommendations. And in fact, I think 35% of the police force, they were game to have some things changed. They needed this oversight from the civilian. The concept of civilian oversight of the military is not new. So oversight of law enforcement is something that needed to become to know. So the police are aware of that and they're game for that. That's significant when you think about the amount that goes, that would say that they need reform. But there's resistance, particularly I think from the union, as they put up barriers nonstop, day in, day out for any kinds of reforms. So, and they always want to have the final say on discipline, where the police chief has the final say on discipline. Now, we had a police chief that was cordial to people of color. And everybody asked me, why are you so, have some animosity? I said, I don't have animosity to any individual, but it is in fact, it's down about the culture of the institution. And that's what I'm talking about. It's a historically racist institution, law enforcement. But they didn't see things that way. So part of the problem that we learned along the way is, and we've come to know, is the white racial frame that's embedded in people's minds. We're socialized into believe that way. That even the ones in the Native community didn't believe what I was saying, but when the white man would say it, they would believe them. So there's a dynamic that is happening there. And then you also have in the African-American community, some individuals would be thinking out of that frame, which would make it difficult they'd be actually voting and working against mutuality and solidarity, and actually continuing the status quo. So those things we had to, and then when you identify those things, it's relational. So it's almost like you're putting them down or putting in, or saying it's really uncomfortable moments when that's brought to light. And in fact, when we realize, say, not only the mass hanging of Dakota's Nation people in Mankato, but also in Duluth, where the 3 lynchings took place, we have much of those that's going on. So the ones that were in the postcard in Duluth, one of the relatives were there, was a relative of Chief Ramsey, which was the police chief of Duluth at the time. And so when we brought that out in light, shine the light on that, there was a lot of hate going around about that how could you tarnish the police chief in such a way? Well, it was facts. And also the one that was actually the police chief, the current police chief, it was his great aunt or great grandmother that made the accusation there. So that was really significant also. And at the time he was second in command, but now he's actual police chief. So there's history there. So we learned some things along the way. And in fact, I think I was the only lone dissenting voice on the creation of the Civilian Review Board, because I said, how can it be a Civilian Review Board if you got retired police officers on it, or if you got active police officers on it? The concept of civilian goes window. So, and then there's danger, because after 5 years, a lot of people were tired, and then if you get in the last round of a fight, you're tired, you make mistakes. And I brought that to light, that we can't allow many mistakes. But when we turned it over to the city council, there was a woman that spoke the language of liberals, I guess you could say, and the hurt and things. But when we actually got behind closed doors, there were things in that where it became, the Civilian Review Board became an instrument that the police use, whether it's in a review or an audit, or else, and they would not allow any independent investigations of the sort. So the police chief and this city councilor were actually in closed doors without us there, and to come up with the final thing, and that's how it went through. So it was really a watered down. Any recommendations that we had from Eileen Luna of the University of Arizona, Tucson, and the rest of us is a civilian analysis, a community analysis of it, was thrown out the window. So, and I objected to it, but I was just the lone one. So we learned quite a lot along the way. And there's also, that takes up with the juvenile detention. We went up there. I looked, they had 24 beds up at the juvenile center, Arrowhead Juvenile Center, and over half of them were filled with Native boys and girls. And people couldn't even see that. They were blind to it. I said, I see there's only 24 beds. So we had, incrementally, they allowed some things to come in there, which is under the guise of Indian Religious Freedom Acts and things of that nature. But there's always those folks within that are headstrong about keeping things as they are, as a punitive measures. And we met a lot of those folks there. So actually, so that way I learned a lot also there on reducing racial disparities in juvenile detention. That was initiated by the Annie Casey Foundation, and put in some things of, for instance, like this racial RAI, risk assessment instrument. And then there was, if you score low, you get released. If you score a little higher, you get alternatives to detention. And then, of course, if you get really high, then you have to be detained. Well, this one Native youth was there, and he was detained, and his score was so low that he should have been automatically released. But this one Caucasian man did the override and kept him on there because they said it wasn't the score on a risk assessment instrument. We overlooked that particular charge. Even if they would have scored high on that charge, you would have still been in an alternative or the immediate release. So I said, this is what we're talking about. This is undermining the initiative to reduce racial disparities. You're overriding any of those recommendations that are from the risk assessment instrument. that's an example. And when I confronted him in a group, in a closed door, he got extremely upset. And actually, we kind of stood up and almost came to, people were kind of scared that it was going to come to something physical. So these individuals, then they doubled down on that systemic racism, that the status quo and things. So it was quite the journey. We learned quite a bit of stuff down there. But I always think that the struggle there is, you know, with the relationship of meeting everybody and coming up to speed with when we share that knowledge and being in community with each other, and the struggles, the heart, to share the victories. I think it's worthwhile. So, and again, the connection between the police, who have first contact with the people, and then they put it over to the unlimited amounts of powers. Everybody's focused on the police, but I think that the prosecutors, they can multiple charge anybody, and those things stay on your record, whether you're convicted or not. They're on your record. Whereas the police, when they're charged and somebody makes a complaint against them, it's like same effect of exoneration or expungement, where it doesn't go on their record. Instance in Cloquet, that the cop who I made a complaint about, it was never showed up. They said he's never had a complaint in his whole 20 years. I said, well, he's got one now. And then when after the complaint, part of them people that are on that civilian review board in Cloquet here, there was no community members there. They were all members of upper middle class, and at least, so it wasn't peer groups. So it's quite pervasive and it's deep. But we find that stuff out. It's kind of, it's still oppressive and sad, but it's kind of exciting as we peel back those layers and we start to realize that it's the hardships that we're feeling, the extended hardships that we're feeling is because of these systems and things. And so we don't have to look at ourselves in such a way anymore. So as the problem. But that's what I got to share for now. So thank you also for listening to me this afternoon. Thank you.
Joe Fagan is our moderator. And Maria, if you are there, we did not reintroduce Joe. We've introduced Joe certainly the last 3 sessions, but just say a word or two,
Sure.
reminding folks of who Joe is. And then Chantel may be out in the general audience, but is not part of the panel. So we need to bring her in. If she would use the information that Jenna sent out so that she can appear among the panelists.
Thank you, Akogiman. So I am pleased to introduce Joe Fagan. He is a distinguished professor of sociology at Texas A&M University. He has done extensive research on race and racism for 56 years and has served as a scholar in residence at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He has written more than 40 books on issues of race, one of which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. He is the recipient of the American Sociological Association's W.E.B. Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award. And his book, The White Racial Frame, now available in a 3rd edition, is considered a basic text in the field of US racial history and a must-read for anyone seeking to understand the reasons for America's racial divide. So we welcome, again, Professor Fagan.
Thank you, Maria.
Yep, and we're still working on Chantel Allen.
Ricardo, why don't you go ahead and give your panel presentation for now.
Okay, and I know that the time slots are changing if Chantel is joining us after all, so why don't you just wave at me when I have 5 minutes left, so you don't have to set up any back channels. So I'm very pleased to be with you here in this space you've created. Those of you I can see and those of you who I know are out there who I can't see. I'm going to start as Ricky did, giving a little bit of background for how I landed where I have. And you'll see there's a lot that Ricky said that resonates with me in terms of my experience. I'm from Barrio en Tierra Baja de Maricao in Western Puerto Rico, a land that has a history of multiple colonial occupations layered on top of each other. And the way I understand organizing and social justice movement building really stems from the fact that I grew up running around in the forest. So that things that I learned from not being in front of a TV and being out on the mountainside are how the natural world moves in cycles, lag times, tipping points, feedback loops, relational webs. And that's the perspective I brought with me when my family moved to Chicago in 1967 when I was 11 years old. I was propelled into activism by the police murders of brown and black people, Manuel Ramos, Fred Hampton, and Mark Clark, all of them community leaders who were killed by the police in 1969. And the Black Panther Defense Committee was my first political home. That's also where I made my first leaflet that I drew with a fundraiser for the Chicago chapter of the Panthers. So that was 50 years ago, and I've been in this ever since. In every movement that I've been part of, the police have been there trying to destroy the movement in every way possible, all of which are illegal, because suppressing protest is actually not a legal thing to do. Also, an important part of my education, when I was young, I hitchhiked what added up to 26,000 miles around the country, the Poor People's Railroad. And that was my best basic training, both as an organizer and as a community artist. So fast forward, I've been centering art in my work for many years and using it in relationship with the struggles that I'm connected with or that I become connected with. Considering my art to be a form of medicine with different herbs useful for different kinds of situations. I became involved in MPD 150, which stands for Minneapolis Police Department 150, because of their anniversary. Because that was an opportunity to shift a narrative. The way we think about what we're experiencing, the story that's at the heart of how we view things, determines everything we do. Organizing is all about the story. I was fortunate in the early 90s to be part of the Columbus Quincentennial Campaign, which was successfully hijacked the anniversary of Columbus's arrival and turned the official federal narrative into a counter narrative. And in fact, President Ford's official, I can't remember who was in office at the time, but the official commission that was meant to celebrate the anniversary ended up collapsing in scandal and all the corporate sponsors pulling out. So really the question was, in an era of Black Lives Matter, why was it that every time there was a police atrocity, there was protest demanding reforms, reforms would be instituted, 3 years later they would have disappeared and there'd be another atrocity? What was behind that? So we set out with this idea of a performance review to study the history, look back in order to look forward, and find out what it is that made these things not work. And typically what people would demand was the requirement that cops live in their neighborhoods, and that they have anti-bias classes, de-escalation training, mental health training, civilian review boards, federal consent decrees, body cams, grand jury or FBI or BCA investigations, diversity training, reform-minded chiefs. And what we found is that these are all the kinds of reforms that have been implemented over and over again for the last 100 years. And while we create these things, civilian review, et cetera, because the community has a hunger to get a hold of, take charge of the situation, the police get involved in order to play us. We're on our 5th civilian review board here in Minneapolis. And recently Bob Kroll, the head of the police union, was recorded on a podcast, I think in Tennessee, describing how you wait out these things. The people's anger dissipates after a while, their attention goes elsewhere, and then you can sabotage and undermine and go back to square one. So what the history taught us, and this is, if you get a chance to look up our report, Enough is Enough, please do so, because it's a very thorough research, not only the history of this department, but also its current practices and some very thoughtful transitional proposals for how to move forward and replace police functions with community functions. There actually is a program behind that idea. But what we found is that the origins, the streams that run into the police departments historically are the slave patrols, the night watches, which were set up to police mostly European immigrant workers in factories in the Northeast in the 1800s, and groups like the Texas Rangers, whose purpose was to terrorize indigenous and Mexicano people in the Southwest. And these have all merged into what is now modern policing. I'll just read you one sentence from the 5 essential findings from our report. And this is just one piece of the work. And this is how police were instituted after emancipation to sabotage any promise that it would mean real freedom. It says the police criminalized dark skin and poverty, channeling millions of people into the prison system, depriving them of voting and employment rights, and thereby preserve privileged access to housing, jobs, land, credit, education, jury duty, voting, running for office for white people. And that really reflects in the housing crisis, in the educational crises, in all of the crises of poverty. It's our conclusion that that is the essential and only unchanging function of the police. Other kind of social servicey things have been glommed on at times when they needed to improve their image, but that's really what they're there and what they're about for. And chiefs of police and mayors, in fact, have very little power over departments. When I came to the States, police departments were still under the control of municipal governments. Mostly the big Chicago machines like Mayor Daley's machine and Rizzo in Philadelphia, these were the last of the machines. And after those machines collapsed, police departments became the most powerful part of municipal governments and can't really be controlled by anyone. And now they've integrated into regional fusion centers, homeland security. They get a lot of their funding from foundations, not from the city, and very tied in with the police equipment supply industry, which is always selling them the next way, best whiz ways to harm people, to play army and with the right equipment, and to surveil with the most sophisticated equipment. So that's kind of the past history that we're talking about. That's the basis for where do we go from here. I think we're at a time in history where really, when we talk about the possibility of a police-free future, we're really not talking about a crazy idea anymore. The continuation of police, or the belief that we're going to turn them into the opposite of what they've always been, I think is more fanciful than the idea that we can recreate a society without. The Dakota and Anishinaabe people didn't have police. I grew up in a barrio in Puerto Rico where there were no police. Police have been around for a couple of 100 years, which is just a few generations at most. And even white supremacy has only been around for about 20 generations since the mid 1400s. So it is possible to imagine something else. And what we see right now, since the rebellion that started on May 25th, is that communities all over the country are actually coming up with their own ideas, their own ways to resource the many healthy resilience programs that exist in communities, with money now being spent on militarization. And of course, it's pretty clear that if you want to reduce 911 calls, give people what they need to get for basic survival: decent housing, decent jobs, food. The solutions, like so many of the solutions under an oppressive society, the solutions are not difficult. It's not about there not being there, it's about the obstacles. And the obstacle isn't about there not being enough political will. It's about there being too much political want and the vested interests. And right now we live in a time of increasing austerity as the empire begins its long, slow decline and collapse. We're seeing more resources put into police, because when there's more desperation and there's more poverty and there's more inequality, they need the police more because people ain't buying it. And that's what we're seeing with the rebellion. They're looking beyond, well, it's just a question of a few bad apples. Well, of course, it's not about people being evil. I was reading about Pablo Escobar's Medellin cocaine cartel in Colombia. Very nasty, vicious organization that also sponsored soccer clubs and stadiums and children's events. And there were people working in those things who had all the best intentions. They just liked playing with kids, giving them resources. But that doesn't change the fact that the organization itself was fundamentally toxic. So I think that I'll just glance here. I guess the real question, Grace Lee Boggs, the organizer and leader from Detroit, late and lamented, would ask the question, what time is it in the clock of the world? And I think that when we look at the time in the clock of the world, the era of police as a 19th century paramilitary force established to enforce racial oppression, its time has passed. I mean, not that it was ever the right thing, but its credibility, its legitimacy is collapsing, and it's time to actually free our imaginations to think about not what can we do with the police, but what do we actually need to take care of each other, including during the transition when a lot of the problems created by the current system will persist. You don't just make the police disappear and think that everything's going to be okay. This needs to be thought out, and that's a collective process that needs to be done at the grassroots of all communities. That's what I got.
Do we have the third panelist coming in yet?
Apparently, we do not.
Okogiman, would you like to talk a bit about policing from your perspective, or would you like to go to questions?
I'd like to go to questions.
Okay, Ricky and Ricardo both. There's this general discussion of defunding the police. What do you make of that, and what's your take on that? I know you both hit at that issue.
I've been talking, Ricky. You want to take it?
Go ahead, Ricky.
Thank you, Joe and Ricardo. Defunding the police is a concept, I think, that really puts a lot of fear, not only in the police department, but also in white America, so-called. I know Ricardo said eloquently that the money is being invested, the remaining monies are being invested in law enforcement because that's the buffer between the inequalities and things. So defunding the police is taking monies and putting it where it could be more efficiently used. There's so much waste. And also, I think it would behoove the community to have a forensic audit of the monies that the police actually have. So who are these foundations and things that are donating money to the police department? And isn't that undermining any kind of community policing concepts? So I think we need a forensic audit of those individual police departments, because when for Duluth, I think even Cloquet, again, when you have 40% of your budget on the police and you still have the same problems that we're talking about in 50 years ago, obviously we need some drastic restructuring of that funding. So anytime monies and funds come in and appropriations, I think it brings out that fear. So that's what I have here for now.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of years ago, the grassroots movements forced the city council to shift $1.1 million that was budgeted for police into community resilience programs. And I think that in fact is a model for where we need to be going, to take these monies that are being used ineffectively to do social service programs for starters and to shift them. I think it's important to think also about the fact that most of what the police do is not solving crimes. They're ineffective at solving property crimes. They don't solve even 50% of the murders. The majority of their time is spent on traffic stops, drug enforcement, morality enforcement, harassing homeless people, hassling young people, doing suspicious person interventions and suspicious vehicle interventions. And so that even when they're technically enforcing the law, they're enforcing it through a racial lens. So if they're doing traffic stops, who are they stopping? If they're enforcing drug busts or nuisance complaints, who are they forcing it against? Who are they using force on? So that even when they're technically enforcing the law, they're actually violating the Constitution. So a few years ago, I determined that I would never again refer to police as law enforcement. There are times when it's convenient, a law lines up conveniently with what they want to do, and so they do enforce that law. But a tremendous amount of their time is spent violating the law. And anyone who's had a verbal confrontation with a cop on the street will tell you that actually they don't know much about the law. Essentially, their attitude is, I am the law. And what I do is legal, and don't talk back to me. So the thing, I mean, I hear what Ricky's saying about people's fears. And I also agree that prosecutors, medical examiners, all of those are part of the system. You saw what happened with the autopsy, the initial autopsy of George Floyd, right? Well, just some kind of medical issue was going on, right? All of this stuff is going on, but the question of fear, I think, is a lot deeper than any proposal, because I think the problem is not that the proposal of defunding frightens white people. It's that anything that is done that has the danger of actually being effective in addressing white supremacy will terrify white people. So I think that there's ways in which we need to organize and organize with our white allies and tell the narrative in a way that we can break the bargain. Because the bargain that was installed with Jim Crow was that police will enforce control collectively over dark communities and only individually over white communities. Whites are collectively innocent, and occasionally individual whites can be guilty. Dark-skinned people are collectively guilty. And that has created this naive world that whites live in where they don't actually know how the country works. And there's this bargain that they support the police and that will keep them safe. We have to break that bargain, and it's not going to come easy, and it's not going to come without frightening people. I don't think that should be our goal, but I think we need to do what we need to do, because the police are one of the essential pillars of the empire. Without it, you cannot enforce the increasing wealth of the rich and the increasing suffering of the poor. They're what hold it in place. And the only way to not frighten white people is to actually not frighten that arrangement, not threaten the system. And I think we're at a crossroads in history where the system is about to destroy the entire planet. and we can't afford to be quite that considerate about white people's fears. They gotta wake up. We just gotta shake the fence, hoping that they'll come down on our side of the fence. And that's what the civil rights movement did. It didn't go and try to reassure whites or convince whites even to win them over. It created a crisis so great that white people had to decide which side of the fence they were going to step down on. The side with black folks or the side with the Klan. And their self-image could not withstand stepping down on the side of the Klan. So it's really, that's you know, it's a different perspective from a lot of ways people approach social change. Because I think, as Martin Luther King would say, I think it has to create that crisis where people must face a moral choice.
One of the questions, and the question you here is, what would a new model of policing look like if funding is shifted to non-policing organizations, like mental health? And this person adds, I know many people do fear that defunding means abolishing, and they fear lawlessness, right, in the streets.
Well, okay, should I respond to that? Oh, really?
Go ahead, Ricardo.
Actually, I do mean abolishing. Abolishing the police is one of the last unfinished pieces of business of emancipation. So when we talk about maintaining the police, that means either we believe that the constant murders of dark-skinned people, the planting of evidence, the falsifying of reports, and all these things are acceptable, or we believe they're not inherent to policing. The first one, of course, is morally corrupt. The second one, I believe, is naive. So I think it's inevitable that we move past that. So I don't actually propose any new model of policing. In our report, because we don't have time to really go into it all, but we address what would we do in cases of domestic violence, in cases of drugs, sex trafficking, property crimes, traffic issues. We have proposals for all of those things. But the most important thing is that people say, well, what are you going to do when somebody's banging on your door in the middle of the night, when there are shots in the alley? Well, of course, we're realistic. You have to have people who have the capacity to intervene with physical force, and even if necessary with weapons. But these should be people who are trained in the arts of helping people in de-escalation. They're tribal police forces that have never shot anybody or never killed anyone. There's, you know, and people in a lot of the helping industries have to deal with violent, angry young men who are totally out of control, and you don't hear very many instances, none actually, of social workers killing their clients. So there are skills, and of course you have training on top of that, so at least there are people trained in emergency intervention who can handle these particular dangerous situations, which are a minuscule part of what the entire police industrial complex is actually about. And of course, it's largely about channeling people into mass incarceration to deprive them of rights so that whites can have easy access to all these things. So that the fear, I want to hear people talking about the fear of what the future looks like if we continue with the police system in place. So I think, yes, I think abolition is a fair way to describe it, but it means that the functions that police perform that are useful can go into the hands of entities that actually might do it well. Because even in violence intervention, the police go in initially with the instinct, almost always, to escalate and to throw their weight around and to intimidate, which only makes crises work, especially since most of these situations involve mental illness, right? And pointing a gun at someone and screaming is not good therapy, right? It doesn't, and then they shoot them because they say they weren't following instructions. So I think when we talk about police, the final function of police, which is to intervene in crisis situations where great bodily harm is being threatened to people, yes, you need people trained to do that, but they must come out of a different historical lineage than slave catchers, the Texas Rangers, and the Night Watches.
Yeah, and again, there's a nice one that connects to that one, and this is the solution we might seek one in which racial ethnic communities protect and safeguard their own people, to establish a new structure where the populace can be safeguarded by a structure that brings together members of its own culture and other cultures. So Ricardo, you're really talking about building it from the foundation up, right? Starting over.
If there are buildings that the police define as being so crime-ridden that they need to be torn down and something else built in their place, the police structure has proven itself to be that. In the last 150 years of Minneapolis policing, you cannot point to a single year or a single month when the police were not primarily fulfilling the role of a racial occupation army. So why not start? It's actually easier often to start with a new building than to try to repair a rotten one. And I think people think of it as being so difficult, but if we start by basing it on the questions of what do our people need? Go out into the communities, ask the elders, what do we need to be safe, well-resourced, and not killing each other? And the answers are there, the wisdom is there. And we don't have to try to reform or reconstruct something that will resist with every fiber of its body and is very skilled at sabotaging our efforts. So let's not bother that, it's too much work.
Ricky, how about you? What about that idea of communities policing their own?
Well, some of the indigenous part of philosophy is that from a clan system and perspective that, for instance, the band would do much of that. We have to take things from the local level, say starting with your immediate family. Now, if someone was to be violent towards your daughter, what would you be inclined to do? And that comes through intergenerational knowledge. There's many forms of knowledge, and you have your dream state knowledge. You've got your ceremonial knowledge, and you got your contemporary knowledge. But that intergenerational knowledge that we could tap into, how do we deal with conflict? And so we build up from there. And how do you deal with somebody that's abusive to your sister, to your aunt, to your younger brother, your older brother that's vulnerable? You go over there, and in the past, you go over there with your brothers, you go over there with your uncles, and make sure that they understand that's not going to be accepted. Not using additional violence. Two wrongs, they say, don't make a right, but to send that message across. So I think that is, and I do agree that the abolition of anything that is called law enforcement is the way to go. Foundationally, when we always talk about in our prayers is to shake the very foundation of this nation, to bring it to its knees, where then you can start to be humbled and start to rebuild. So a foundation that's is based on racial inequality needs to be crumbled. It needs to be shook hard enough. And the abolition of an institution that upholds any kind of imperialist way is the route to go. So they say that we can't tweak things, we need to rebuild completely. I think that's where the power is, because the power is in the people. And when we give it to an institution, it never comes back to the people. They keep it, so we need to demand it back and take it back. And I think that's what the movement of Black Lives Matter, being a particular rather than a universal concept. So I agree.
Ricardo, there's several people here asking how they can get a copy of the Enough is Enough report.
The report is available on mpd150.com as something you can read online, as a PDF that can be downloaded. It's also available as an audiobook read by some of the greatest voice talents in the Twin Cities. The book itself, the current edition is out of print. Within a few weeks, we'll be issuing an expanded edition that will be available certainly throughout Minneapolis and beyond, starting in 2 or 3 weeks. And then it'll be available readily almost everywhere.
I guess people can also get it from ASDIC, ASDIC.
In the future, yes. So I'll be sure to be in communication with Ricardo to have that available also through ASDIC.
And one sort of related to this, Ricardo, you and Ricky both can probably talk to this. Are there examples of police departments being defunded and some of the things they do, such as mental health, dealing with mental health, moved into other departments and facilities? Are there departments that have been successful in partially dismantling that?
Well, I mean, there have been some places. There's a program started in Eugene, Oregon. I can't remember its name right now. That started out as, it's mostly sort of a ride-along thing. 911 calls being diverted to mental health people instead of cops. Or if cops go, they have to have social workers or mental health people with them. That's been very successful. So we have a lot of piecemeal programs in different places. But this idea has been so off the table that no, this has not been attempted, because only 5 years ago, this was considered so fantastical that you would be laughed at if you mentioned the possibility of doing it. But I think it's similar to thinking about our dysfunctional healthcare system. Like, what is the model for a healthcare system? Well, there's useful pieces of a model that you can find in Sweden, in Cuba, in Mozambique, in Canada, and every place has to create its own solution, of course. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly places where some programs have been moved, but no, as far as the kinds of reforms that substantially make police less violent, in places where that's happened, it's been very short-lived, and then it defaults back to the norm. Those have not been on this model of actually replacing police. Those have been more reformist in nature.
Ricky, did you want to add to that or comment on that one?
Just a bit that most of any kind of piecemeal adjustments that the police department makes is really for public relations and how they're viewed. Again, like the ride-alongs that have the citizen ride along with them to get their view, their perspective. It's kind of like an audit or a review of internal investigations for the civilian review boards. You're given their perspective, and then they bring you along so your conclusion is the same as their conclusion. So much of the stuff that they wait you out, and I think that's through the long-term nurturing future leaders to come along, because I think the investment in the police department is so profound now, and it's got so much incentive, unlimited amounts of resources, and the animalistic instinct to hurt is there, and it's psychological. But I think that so that's why they double down on that indifference that they have within as a culture. So again, they're not going to allow. We have to take and demand. So
yeah, there's several questions on here that get to that ultimate question. That is, it's moving on me.
Time to take a trip. Right from your living.
Here's one that says, currently white people have such power and control.
This is high.
How do we ever change things such as defunding the police when whites fight so hard against it? And then another one that says, I don't think that white people are going to believe that the police are meant to do what Ricardo was saying. I don't even think the police think so. I wonder if there's a way to incorporate Ricardo's historical view with the historical view of a police officer who is very open to major change. Both of them are problematizing white people, especially those with power, Brian. Any thought?
Well, I don't think social change comes through white people. I think white people respond when dark people organize and create a compelling vision. What I learned from Fred Hampton and the organizing I was exposed to in Chicago, he organized an alliance with the Puerto Rican Young Lords and the white street gang, the Young Patriots, not by meeting them halfway, but by making a better offer. All facing roach-infested and rat-infested apartments, poor housing, and few job prospects. Let's unite and fight for those, and then all of a sudden we're not enemies anymore. So making a better offer is the key to social justice organizing. And people come along. Right now we're seeing unprecedented protests in almost all the counties in the United States, many of whom have only white people there, have only white populations, and they're having Black Lives Matter protests. I think we are at a teachable moment. And at a teachable moment, truth-telling is the only thing we can rely on. And truth-telling terrifies people. People will try to tell it in a way that makes clear that it's not going to kill them. But in the discrepancy between truth and lies, we cannot meet halfway. And the perspective of a cop in terms of their good intentions or whatever, that's fine. Some of the members of our group had family members who were cops. Not about demonizing. But in terms of saying their historical narrative is equally valid with the one we're putting out, that's actually not the case.
Ricky, any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it comes down to solidarity and mutuality. And what are the costs to the groups, socially, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And we know that emotion plays a huge part in driving your subconscious thoughts. So I believe that that's the key in a mutual world that is environmentally looks like we're headed for disaster. We're in it together. So there has to be buy-in somewhere along the line there from the majority of people in this nation, in this country. So morally, spiritually, so it comes down to solidarity and mutuality and the emotions that drive our behaviors. So,
and truth is medicinal.
Go ahead.
Truth is medicinal. That
yes.
Frederick Douglass said that lies, that truth can, in his 19th century lingo, truth can repose on its own inherent strength, whereas the lie cannot afford to. It must be supported by external props. Inside our bodies, we know the truth. The truth resonates. It takes a tremendous amount of distraction and self-medication for white people to hold on to the lie that keeps white supremacy in place. The truth is much more healing. And we're coming at a time when the lies are collapsing. So what are they going to do? Either you cling more tightly to them and become an open white supremacist, or you open yourself up to the fact that the people's movements for justice is a better offer. I think that I agree with Ricky that it's about solidarity and buy-in and opening up our struggle, and we want to be able to welcome everybody into it, never demonize anyone, but also don't soft pedal our truths.
There's that related idea that the critical race theorist Derek Bell often talked about interest convergence. His argument is that people of color only get significant change in this country when some segment of the white population has a common interest and buys into it. Is that what you're talking about? Interest convergence?
Yes, in a way. I think that the converging interests are always there. I believe that the driving force of history is unfortunately the oppressed. It's not fair, but justice and fairness aren't the same thing. The oppressed always have to liberate their oppressor in some ways because the oppressor is not capable of it. And I think that's really what I'm talking about, is that the solidarity, you know, when I came into the struggle, there was a common movement among yellow power, red power, black power, poor whites. There was that horizontal solidarity that created a narrative that everybody could see themselves in. That includes white folks, but I don't see it as a dichotomy that white folks are necessarily the key who have to be convinced. Certainly, they can no longer be united against us. We need to win enough over and at least paralyze those who can't make up their minds so that they're not fighting us.
And then there's one here about guns. This one says, one reason people say we need armed police is that so many people carry guns. And there's several others along that line. How important is stronger gun control policy to a realistic disbanding of the police? Ricky, you want to try that one?
Well,
Guns, yeah.
we live in a very violent society. Of course, we so many guns that and gun culture and pushed many social forces leading us to be violent. The foundation is on violence. And when a nation is founded on violence, it's already set its course for its own destruction. So when one has the guns as a means of a right, that's what we're talking about, where it sets its own discourse for its own destruction. So guns are definitely a problem. So it's a very divisive, loaded, no pun intended there, weapon. So it's been weaponized and it's been criminalized. The people say a person of color goes and tries to get a permit for the right to carry. The scrutiny that's placed upon that individual is much more so than so to rid of a populace of weapons is part of the problem. You go to a shooting range. Very seldom will you see people of color at that shooting range. Guns, the right to bear arms is basically the right for white America to bear guns, and the push for people of color to be without weapons. So you've identified the a huge problem there.
Recently, we had a major shooting in Uptown. We had a lot of spiking shootings everywhere. And this is in a city where, a half or whatever it is of the city budget is going into the police. So this is not a preview of what happens when there are no police. This is actually what we get when there are police. And some people say that the police let those things happen just because they're pissed. Which again shows what other city department will put people's lives in danger in order to punish their opponents, which just would underline the corruption. So this is what we have. Now, yeah, this is a country flooded with guns, and guns are a form of self-medication for fear. Unfortunately, it's an unhealthy form of self-medication. There are other forms that are not as destructive, but I personally think, and I'm not speaking for any group in saying this, that there's no possibility right now to sort of go out there and sort of legislate guns away from people. There's certainly ways you can try to reduce their use, but I think the real issue is to begin lowering the desperation that causes fear and conflict. A stable shelter, stable housing, food, well-resourced schools. I mean, the communities that don't have a big police problem are these suburbs and these well-resourced white suburbs because they have all those other nice things, right? And it's dark people not having those things that terrifies white people because they think we're going to come and get their stuff. So once you start stabilizing people's nervous systems by giving them the basics of life that they can live on, you start seeing the reactivity of the whole culture begin to go down. And then we can start talking about weapons.
So racial inequality in the society affects all these problems we're talking about.
Yeah, racial, class, all of these forms of inequality, which are so intertwined.
Here's one that talks about John Lewis, which is probably a nice thing to feature John Lewis today. It says, John Lewis's siblings did not join him in his work. He went out and found those activists who shared his vision, and he did not get discouraged about those close to him who were not interested. Have either of the speakers faced this issue? This is also my experience with family and friends.
Could you reread the first sentence of that?
John Lewis's siblings did not join him in his work. He went out and found those activists who shared his vision, and he did not get discouraged about those close to him who were not interested. This is also my experience with my family and friends. Have either of the speakers faced this? Basically, back to the, how do you create organizations for change? Right.
Well,
Ricky, you want to tackle that one?
okay. If we wait around for our family too long, then our efforts need to be channeled towards someone that is, we can, in mutuality, help each other come to a better society. It's kind of like if you're devoting too much time to somebody that's not hearing you and not wants to change their ways, you're wasting your time there. So they tell us to move on to someone else that is that we can help, and then we can see some change, and then we can celebrate some victories together. I think that waiting, we don't have the luxury to wait. So someone like the icon of John Lewis that is gravitating to others that are within the struggle. And then along the way, his family, even though they're not in the midst of it, can also celebrate those victories that he's had along with his cohorts and the ones the ones that are doing the work in the struggle. And they might not want to celebrate those the hardships, the pain, but they will celebrate the victories. And I think there's value in that. And sooner or later, they'll come along. And sometimes your own family is your biggest critic of the work that you're doing within the community. You know, like you're wasting your time, you're doing this, it's never going to change. White supremacy is here to stay. All of these voices, this noise that you hear within the community, within your family, is really taxing on an individual that's out in front. And anytime you're a leader, you're out in front, you're under a microscope, you're getting criticized left and right. People are shooting at you from behind, gossip and all of this other things that make it hard to be in community. But so that's why we tend to navigate to one another, and then we can heal together. We can help each other in a true community. And the benefits will be felt by everybody. When Indigenous peoples do ceremony, we don't only do ceremony for Native people, we do it for all people. And because we know that this race thing that's now global is really a social construct. So we do things for all people. So the benefits are vast.
And the way I would sort of echo what Ricky just said is to say that you don't try to start a fire with wet wood. You get the dry kindling, you pull it off the bottoms of branches, those little leaves, you make a pile of that and get that going. And then that'll dry out the twigs. And when you pile those on, you get a bigger fire and eventually you dry out the logs, right? So that, yes, that strategy of going for the low-hanging fruit, going for the kindling. Start your fire with kindling. Eventually that wet log will catch, but if you keep wasting your matches, holding them against this wet piece of wood, you're going to run out of matches, and the wood is still going to be wet.
And people looking for people to talk to, work with, can look at the two groups that are sponsoring this discussion, right? Freck and Hesde. Okogimon, would you like to finish this up? We're at the time limit now.
Yes, thank you very much. What a beautiful discussion we've had. Just outstanding. Thank you very, very much. I've learned so much today, and my looking at the conversation on the chat and the Q&A, people very much have appreciated everything that that they've experienced in this panel this afternoon. Ricardo, you gave some information on enough, and we want to encourage people to look at the chat side panel, because people have sent us information on where we can find that. And also we look forward to the publication of the next edition of Enough, and we will look for ways to share that with the community. I could see follow up in having conversation groups, circles that meet to discuss this. And so I'm hoping that you will recognize that many of us will want to collect together to discuss what you have given us, and also think about in what ways you might assist us in that effort to understand what is there, to move from there. Maybe there are action areas there, what we can do in our communities. I'm in a rural context, and there are many different communities around the state that would wish to look at these issues and to be in dialogue regarding them. So again, thank you. And thank you, Ricky, giving your perspective and your experiences on this. That has been very helpful. You might have an opportunity to look at some of the feedback that people have given on the chat line. So encourage you to do that. I don't know, Ricky or Ricardo, if you'll be able to join one of the chat rooms, but momentarily we'll go into the chat rooms to continue the conversation. Joe, thank you so very much. It was you who suggested that we have this series, and we have been able to follow through with the support of many folk in FREC, in FREC, and also in our ASDEC community. So thank you so very much. Yes, Ricardo?
I just wanted to acknowledge the absence, and it's not the fault of the organizers, because you invited two powerful women to be on this panel who were not able to be here, but just wanted to acknowledge that we're having this discussion without the voices of our sisters, of women present in it, which is always something that we want to be aware of when we find that kind of thing happening.
Yes, thank you for lifting that up. So the effort was there, and through no fault of their own, these two wonderful community leaders and activists were not able to join us at this time because of commitments, work, activist work that both of them are doing. So we will look for other opportunities to bring their voices in. And I thank very much Erin, one of our interpreters, and the other interpreter, I think her name is Rachel. I don't remember at the moment, but thank you so very much to the interpreters who have enabled us to widen our community. So I don't have anything more to add. We will continue this conversation through our FREC and our ASDIC, Facilitators for Racial Equity and Anti-Racism Dialogue Circles. We will invite you into other conversations, into workshops that have been scheduled. And as the enough study is made available, we will look for opportunities to create some circles around this book. And maybe some of the people who are in this community that Ricardo has identified earlier, maybe we can have people from that community be facilitators for such groups. But I would like to find a way to build on what you have started and to bring more people into conversation. So thank you very much. Unless Maria or Jenna can add some comments on something that we should be saying, we will move into our discussion groups, and we will look for facilitators. Jenna, I think, has identified some facilitators who will join us in on those those conversation groups. Jenna?
Yeah, that sounds good. Go to our website, asthecircle.org, and we hope to see you there. I'll also just be closing out the session with a mix a DJ made for us. So I hope you like it. It's about police violence. It's by a local DJ. So stay tuned for that if you are interested. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Take care. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Trying to get this music to play now. Let's see if I can do this. It working earlier. For some reason, my sound isn't going through. Can either of you hear any sound?
No.
Sorry, I know it's going wrong. Sorry.
So I'm going to be signing because I don't think it makes sense. I think it would skew the conversation to have to be present in one of those groups, and I think people should discuss otherwise. So
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this
Thank you.
opportunity, and yeah, good to see and to meet all of you respectively.
Thank you very much.
Ricardo, take care.
I too feel the same way.
Things got to get better. Showing what the leaders say. Maybe we should write a letter. Said, dear Mr. Man, we don't understand why poor people keep struggling, but you don't lend a helping hand. Matthew 5:5 say, the meek shall inherit the earth. Gonna be down that way, but you've been tripping since the day of your birth. Who says that to kill is a sin? It started at Brasenko War that your people believe. Who says that water